Good afternoon. I'm going to tell you some pretty terrible things about Russia today. And I thought that I would be telling you probably the worst story of the day, but having heard the story about Bangladesh earlier, I think that probably the two are on par. Although what I'm going to share with you are some pretty gruesome details of how bad it is in Russia. I'm not a lawyer. I'm probably the only non-lawyer in the room here. But as several of the speakers before me said, that you oftentimes, even as barristers, have to become investigators, or lawyers have to become lobbyists. And so as a hedge fund manager, I've become a lawyer, barrister, lobbyist, investigator, and various other things. And I guess what I've proven is that you don't necessarily have to have formal training to do this, and depending on how strong your will is, you can sometimes do an even better job than the people who are trained to do this. I'd like to, you gave a very beautiful introduction, and I'm just going to backtrack a little bit into your introduction just to get exactly to where I want to get to in terms of telling the Magnitsky story. But I don't have to go all the way back to the introduction. So, as was said before, I was this big investor in Russia, and I started to confront corruption very publicly by doing private investigations into how the corruption took place, and then share that with the FT, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, etc. And for a number of years, it was a very effective strategy, because it turns out that the people I was fighting with, the guys stealing money from companies that I was investing in, were also stealing power from the newly elected president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. And so there's this strange concept that your enemy's enemy is your friend. And although I've never met Vladimir Putin, when I started to put all of the nastiness that I discovered in companies like Gazprom and the electricity company and the National Savings Bank out into the public domain, he would step in and fire people, issue presidential decrees, and do all sorts of things to disempower his enemies, which helped me very much as a person fighting the same thing. And so for about 4 years, I had the most beautiful existence that one could have in life. Every time I would publicize a scandal, he would step in and get the bad guys. And as a result of that, the value of my fund would go up. And so I was in one of these great situations where I was actually making money and getting the bad guys at the same time. Can you imagine that? When you all take a profession which is not based on maximizing profits to get the bad guys, or to save the good guys, or save the innocent guys, or whatever it is that you choose to do. But it's oftentimes not a profit maximizing profession. And a lot of people in my profession just choose to maximize profit, but never can do anything good with their life. And so for about 4 years, I was able to have this beautiful confluence of doing good and making money at the same time. But of course, it was too good to be true. And in late 2003, Putin arrested the richest man in Russia, Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos, and he put him on trial, and they allowed the television cameras to film him on trial. And as you may know now, there's no presumption of innocence in a Russian court, and as a result, they put the defendants in a cage. And so they allowed the richest man in Russia to be filmed sitting in a cage. And if you were the 17th richest guy in Russia, and you saw the richest guy sitting in a cage, what's your natural reaction? You don't want to sit in a cage. And so one by one, all of the other oligarchs in Russia went to Vladimir Putin and said, "Vladimir, what do we have to do to make sure we don't sit in a cage?" And he said, it's very simple, 2 words, 50%. From that moment on, Vladimir Putin became the business partner of all the oligarchs in Russia. He became the richest man in Russia, possibly the richest man in the world. And all of a sudden, all of my naming and shaming campaigns were no longer welcome. And in November of 2005, as I was traveling back to Russia after having lived there for 10 years, after being the largest foreign portfolio investor in their country, I was stopped at Sheremetyevo 2 VIP Lounge. I was detained for 15 hours in the detention center at the airport, and then I was expelled from the country and declared a threat to national security. Now, when the Russians go after you, they don't go after you just softly. And I realized that that was just the beginning of a campaign which was going to get much uglier. And so I said to myself, what do I have to do to make sure that I don't suffer the same fate as Michael Hordakovsky, the guy from Yukos? And so I did two things. I liquidated every last penny I held in Russia. I sold every last share, $4.5 billion worth of stock, quietly over a 6-month period without anybody knowing. And I evacuated my staff. And I dusted off my hands after that, and I said, wow, what an experience. Glad I got out clean. Time to move on to other things. But as I suspected when I was preparing myself for this thing, the Russians hadn't quite finished with me. And that's where we get to the story of Sergei Magnitsky. On June 4th, 2007, so about 18 months after I was kicked out of the country, 25 police officers raided my office, and 25 more police officers raided the office of my American law firm, Firestone Duncan. And the raid was led by this character over here, Lieutenant Colonel Artem Kuznetsov. He led both raids. And the specific purpose of these raids was to get hold of all the statutory documents for our investment holding companies, which at this point were empty, but he didn't know that. So the purpose of, he gathered up all of these stamped, sealed certificates from our investment holding companies through which we had invested all of our money in Russia. And then the next thing we knew, we no longer owned our companies anymore. Our companies had been fraudulently transferred out of the name of our trustee into a company named Pluton, which was owned by a guy named Viktor Markelov. We did a little criminal record search, and discovered that Viktor Markelov had been convicted of murder in 2001 and had been let out of jail after 1 year, presumably by the Interior Ministry, to put his name on documents of things they wanted to seize. So basically, the police seized documents which were then handed over to Viktor Markelov to steal our companies. So at this point, we hire a number of lawyers to try to figure out how to stop this exercise, this terrible thing from happening. But we had no economic interest anymore, but it was purely we didn't want to get tied up in some awful scandal. And one of the lawyers we hired was a young man named Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei was a 36-year-old lawyer. He was working for this law firm, Firestone Duncan, an American firm. And he was about the smartest lawyer we knew in Moscow. He was one of these guys that could do 10 things in the time it takes other people to do one. He was the kind of guy who you could call at 10 o'clock at night in London, which would be 1 o'clock in the morning in Moscow, with a very urgent question, and he would get up and stay up until he answered that question. And he was a guy we assigned to figure out what had gone wrong, why these guys were doing this, and what we could do to stop them. And he went out and investigated, and he came back with the most unbelievable story. The first thing he said was, in addition to stealing our companies, the documents seized by the police were then used to fabricate and forge a bunch of backdated contracts to claim we owed $1 billion to 3 empty shell companies we had never heard of. Those shell companies, according to his research, then took us to court without our knowledge, because we no longer owned our companies, and sued our companies for $1 billion. In court, 3 defense lawyers, I should say defense lawyers, were hired by the people who stole our companies to defend our companies. But they didn't defend our companies. They immediately pled guilty to $1 billion of fake liabilities in court. Now, the judge didn't seem to think anything was wrong with this situation, even though the defendant and the plaintiff immediately agreed on $1 billion claim. And he signed over, in a number of, actually, they signed over, because there's more than one judge, $1 billion worth of judgments against our companies. The police then went and raided all of our banks looking for $1 billion of assets. But they couldn't find $1 billion of assets because there were no assets in the country. And so at this point, I thought that the whole story was finished. And I started to relax. But Sergei, my lawyer, said, this story is not finished. I don't know how the story is going to end, but the story is not finished. And Sergei said, I'd like to investigate some more and figure out what's really going on here. And we said, God bless you, go and do it. Sergei goes out and investigates, sends out all sorts of different letters and requests for information to all sorts of different places. And eventually the story crystallizes into something that's the most remarkable thing I've ever seen. And certainly the most remarkable thing he had ever seen, which was after they failed to get our assets, this group of officials, police officers, and criminals went to the Russian tax authorities. And our companies, when we were liquidating all of our shares in 2006, reported $1 billion of profits and paid $230 million of taxes. So the bad guys go to the tax authorities, and they say a mistake has been made in the previous year's tax filing. That $1 billion of profits was really not correct. Look, here's $1 billion of losses confirmed by the court. Therefore, $1 billion minus $1 billion equals 0. Profits were then 0. And we'd like to file an amended tax return and ask for the $230 million of taxes that was paid last year to be returned. It was the largest tax refund in Russian history. It was applied for on the 23rd of December 2007, 2 days before Christmas. And it was approved 1 day later on Christmas Eve, the largest tax refund in Russian history. To this group of criminals and this group of police officers and various others. It was truly, truly shocking. Now, when we publicized this and we reported it to the police and reported it to a number of different law enforcement agencies, thinking that the good guys would get the bad guys and that would be the end of the story. Instead of the good guys getting the bad guys and that being the end of the story, the police opened up a criminal case against all 7 of our lawyers from 4 different law firms who worked for us. I went to each of our lawyers and I said, I'm truly sorry this has happened. It's my fault. By you working for me, this has happened to you. I don't want you to be in harm's way. I'd like you to leave the country, come to the UK where you'll be safe, and let's just wait till the storm passes. Now, it's not an easy conversation to have. If I were to ask any of you to leave the UK and to go to Portugal today, where you don't speak Portuguese, maybe some of you do, I don't know, but it's not an easy conversation to have on a moment's notice. But 6 out of the 7 of my lawyers said, yes, we're leaving. They were all in their 40s and had seen how capricious the whole Soviet system could be. They were grown-ups enough. But Sergei wasn't. He was 36, and he was an optimist and idealist. And he said, I know the law perfectly. I've not broken the law, and I'm not leaving. And he stayed. He not only stayed, but this is the remarkable thing. On October 7th, 2008, Sergei Magnitsky testified against the police officers who raided the office and the criminals who were involved in this whole tax fraud. 1 month later, on November 6th, 2008, Oleg Luganov, the deputy head of the Russian Interior Ministry, then assigns Kuznetsov, the man whom Sergei has testified against, to investigate the crime. 6 days later, Oleg Luganov assigns Kuznetsov to make Sergei Magnitsky the prime suspect. And then 12 days later, on the 24th of November, Kuznetsov and 2 of his subordinates arrest Sergei Magnitsky in front of his wife and 2 children and put him in pretrial detention. They then start to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony and plead guilty to the $230 million tax theft. They put him in a cell with twice as many inmates as beds to sleep deprive him. They kept the lights on 24 hours a day. They put him in a cell with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in a cell with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They didn't allow him to see his children ever again. They allowed him 1 visit 11 months after he was detained with his mother and wife. His arrest was condemned by the Council of Europe, by the International Bar Association, by the UK Law Society, by various other organizations, to no effect. After 6 months of this terrible treatment in prison, he starts getting sick. The prison diagnoses him, and these are all official documents that I'm showing you here. The prison diagnoses him with pancreatitis and gallstones. He's lost 20 kilos at this point, has extreme stomach pain. And they say that he needs an operation on the 1st of August 2009. On the 25th of July 2009, the person in charge of his investigation, Oleg Silchenko, decides to move him from the prison that has a hospital that can treat him to a prison called Butyrka, which is famous in Russia for being one of the toughest prisons out there. It's a maximum security prison, and most significantly for Sergei, this prison has no facilities in which to do an operation on his pancreatitis and gallstones. Interestingly, the transfer order was also signed by the deputy head of the entire federal penitentiary system in Russia, which suggests that this was a very interesting case for the most important people there. Inside of Butyrka, his health completely breaks down, and I'll just read this to you because it's just so heartbreaking. This is a letter from Magnitsky to his lawyer. He says, on the 23rd of August, 2009, at 4:30 p.m., I felt excruciating pain in the solar plexus. I laid down and struggled with it. A bit later, the pain started to increase again, even harder than earlier. To stand against it could only be possible by sitting in a crouched position. The pain was so hard, I could not even breathe. On the 24th of August, around 4 p.m., a pain attack started again. I could not lay down this time, as it was hard to sustain it, and again I was crouching. My cellmate started to pound on the door, crying for help, but no one came. Things became so desperate that Sergei and his lawyer wrote 20 different official requests to the prison administration, to the Interior Ministry, to the prosecutor's office, to this court, to the judges, requesting medical attention. And these are all pictures of the letters and various excerpts from those letters. And every single request was either ignored or rejected. And these are actual rejection letters for his request for medical attention. Here's one on the top from Oleg Stolchenko, the guy who moved him to the prison that's in that facility, saying, I deny in full the request for medical examination of Magnitsky. Going down to the bottom, two judges say the request to review complaints about withholding of medical care and cruel treatment is denied. Deny the request to review the medical records and conditions of detention is irrelevant, says Judge Stashina. Well, if you have somebody who's desperately ill and you don't treat them and they have pancreatitis, eventually things get terrible, really terrible. And on the night of November 16, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. Only then did they move him from Butyrka back to the prison that had a medical facility. But instead of treating him, when he arrived at Matroshka Tishina, the prison with a medical facility, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him for 1 hour and 18 minutes. We know that because they documented it themselves in the prison. We have the documents proving it. While he was being beaten, a civilian doctor who had been called earlier was waiting outside the door, waiting to treat him. They wouldn't allow the civilian doctor inside the room for 1 hour and 18 minutes. He says the medical team arrived at 8 p.m. but was not let in to see the patient. They were made to wait for more than an hour. And then when they finally were able to come into the room, the civilian doctor said, I was shocked to find the patient not in a hospital room, but in a regular cell on the floor dead. Sergei Magnitsky died that night at the age of 37. So what I've just described to you is the crime. What I'd like to, but what's most interesting and what's most significant about this is the cover-up, and that's what makes this case so helpful in terms of understanding what's going on in Russia. Because for all of these, this is just one case. But for every Sergei Magnitsky, there's just so many other cases. And when you see how they've operated in the system, you get to understand what's really going on out there. So the first part of the cover-up was the difference in testimony of the civilian doctor who had no obligation to the system whatsoever, and the prison doctor. So the civilian doctor said they found Sergei Magnitsky on the floor dead in an isolation cell before 9 p.m. The official prison report said he was found on the resuscitation table in the hospital where they were trying to resuscitate him at 9:50 p.m. Why the difference? Because they never expected that the information about the rubber batons was ever going to come out, that he was beaten. When Sergei's mother learned about what had happened, she went to the prison early in the morning on the 17th of November, and she went with the lawyer, and they met with the officials in the prison hospital. And they said, when they asked what the cause of death was, at 10:30 in the morning, they were told the cause of death was pancreonecrosis and a rupture of the abdominal membrane, which would be consistent with the untreated pancreatitis. When the press started calling the Interior Ministry at noon, they changed the cause of death. And they said it was heart failure, no signs of violent death, because they finally figured out that it would be stupid to say that he died of pancreonecrosis when they would deny him medical attention. Sergei's mother then requested to have an independent pathologist attend the state autopsy. And the prosecutor's office rejected the request, saying the petition for an independent pathologist is denied. All of our pathologists are equally independent. She then requested to have the body removed to conduct their own autopsy themselves. That was also rejected by the prosecutor's office, where they said there is no reason to doubt the results of the state autopsy. And so on November 20th, 4 days after Sergei died, he was buried without any third-party medical examination. This is this is pictures. I'm sorry to show you these ugly pictures, but these are pictures of Sergei's body, where they're saying there's no sign of violent death, and you can see deep lacerations in his wrists, and you can see black and blue marks, and what it looks like is there was some type of very bad situation right before he died. This was enough to have it, apparently, and I should point out something about the Russian law enforcement system, is that even though it's completely corrupt, there are people in the system that aren't part of the conspiracy to do corruption. And so, for example, a detective inside the investigative committee of in a local office near the prison decided that there was enough evidence based on these photographs of his body and based on other things, according to him, to open up a murder investigation. He wrote this in a document, which was then, this was written on the 19th of November, 3 days after Sergei died. Sergei's mother wrote 4 different requests to open a criminal case about his torture and death. On the 18th, 20th, 24th, and 25th of November, all of them were rejected. And instead, the Interior Ministry embarked on one of the most egregious cover-ups I've ever seen. Irina Dudukina, the official spokeswoman of the Interior Ministry, on the 17th of November said, after he died, they said, and I should just remind you, there were 20 requests for medical attention, and there were at least 6 written denials of his request for medical attention. And according to her, there had not been a single complaint from Magnitsky about his health in the criminal case file. He never complained about his health. His sudden death was a shock for the investigators. 2 days later, the investigative committee of the prosecutor's office says there's been no ground identifying to warrant launching a criminal investigation. 7 days later, the prosecutor's office themselves say no violations in the actions of detention center officials have been found as part of the probe. The death occurred from acute heart failure. The probe has concluded that medical care was provided in detention. Magnitsky never complained about his health or daily conditions in custody. The head of the prison where he died said, no violations found, cease any further probe, file the case into the archive. The Deputy Interior Minister of Russia, Alexei Anishin, says, out of 111 complaints from pretrial detention reviewed by the Interior Ministry, not a single complaint contained anything to do with his health or conditions of his detention. Now, the Russian system is authoritarian, but it's not totalitarian. And it's a big difference, because in an authoritarian system you have all this stuff that I've just described, but you also have little pockets of goodness. And one of the pockets of goodness was a thing called the Public Oversight Commission, the Moscow Public Oversight Commission, which was mandated by law to allow independent people into the prison to do prison investigation. And the Moscow Public Oversight Commission had been formed about 9 months before Sergei Magnitsky's death and had their first big investigation into Sergei Magnitsky's death. And on the 28th of December 2009, they published a very conclusive report saying that he was systematically denied medical care, he was subjected to physical and psychological pressure, his right to life was violated by the state, investigators, prosecutors, and judges all played a role in his torturous conditions, and everybody lied about the situation afterwards. This was conclusive, they named names, and most importantly, they sent it to every different law enforcement agency and the presidential administration. We're now 2 years later, and there hasn't been a single acknowledgement or reply to this report. So, as a result, the most famous human rights activist in Russia, Lyudmila Alexieva, wrote her own criminal complaint to the investigative committee in Russia alleging torture and murder. She sent this complaint in on the 27th of March 2010. 2 months later, she got a reply saying, it is hereby refused to initiate criminal proceedings on the basis of no crime committed. We were able to connect Sergei Magnitsky's mother with a group called Physicians for Human Rights in the United States, which provides doctors and pathologists to conduct post-mortem examinations in high-profile human rights cases. And they gave her a list of things to request in terms of Sergei's data, tissue samples, etc., which were still being held by the Interior Ministry. And she started writing request after request after request to get this stuff. And every single one of her requests were denied. And I won't bother reading you all the stupidity of their denials. Now, in a system that's corrupt like the Russian system is, they can just unilaterally declare, they can say black is white and white is black. And that's usually the end of the story. And the way these things work is they can say no crime was committed. There'll be like 2 weeks worth of articles in the newspaper after the person dies, and then that's the end of it. No more story. But this story just wouldn't die. And this chart shows you how many newspaper articles have been written about this in Russia since Sergei died. 3,500 newspaper articles. Why so many articles? Several things. First, because Sergei wrote 450 complaints in his 358 days in detention, and so we have an absolute granular documentary record of every single thing that happened, and the world knows it. And the second thing is that Sergei wasn't an oligarch or a politician. He was just a regular guy. He was a lawyer who wanted Starbucks coffee in the morning, went and sat in his cubicle and did his law. And everybody said to themselves, if that guy can be taken out of his middle-class life and put in the worst hellhole in Russia and then tortured to death, we could be Sergei Magnitsky. And it just kept on reverberating around the system. And the authorities said, my God, what do we do? We've won this case because we control the law enforcement system, but we're losing this case in the court of public opinion. They never encountered this problem before. So what did they decide to do? They decided to fight us in the court of public opinion. And the first person to join the fight in the court of public opinion was Oleg Luganov, the guy who had authorized Artyom Kuznetsov, the person that Sergei had accused, to arrest him. He goes on Business FM radio station on the 7th of June 2010, and he says for the whole period of his detention, the investigation did not receive a single complaint about his health. You then have the most senior law enforcement official in Russia, Alexander Bastrykin, head of the Russian equivalent of the FBI, saying there's no ground to think that his death was connected to the actions of officials and prosecutors. There's no objective evidence or information showing that he was prosecuted illegally or that physical and psychological pressure was applied to him. You have the head of the Moscow court, Olga Yegorova, saying Magnitsky did not request to be released due to his health. The judges probably did not know about his health. There were 2 of her judges that rejected his request for medical attention. You have the head of the Russian federal penitentiary system saying the death of Magnitsky was an accident that was hard to perceive. He received medical care for his diagnosed illnesses. You have the justice minister of Russia says, let's not make an innocent victim out of Magnitsky. You have the general prosecutor of Russia saying, following the probe by the general prosecutor's office, no wrongdoing or violations of law were identified in the actions of Interior Ministry officers. You have the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Russian Parliament saying Magnitsky never complained about himself. So while these guys are busy saying nothing happened, we're saying to ourselves, okay, this was not a crime of ideology. This was not a crime of politics. This was a crime of money. It was all about the $230 million that Sergei Magnitsky discovered, they stole, and testified about. So let's look for the money. So who do we start with? Let's start with the officer who raided the offices and took the documents who arrested Magnitsky, Artyom Kuznetsov. Well, Artyom was not so sophisticated about how he was going to organize his life. And he's got a salary of $10,200 a year, and he's got assets registered in his mother and his wife's name in excess of $3 million. And both these people his wife doesn't work and his mother's a pensioner. Pavel Karpov, the guy who was given custody of the documents seized by Kuznetsov that were used in the crime, has a salary of $6,000 a year, and he's got $1.3 million worth of property registered in his pensioner mother's name, including a Porsche Carrera in her name. And then the real coup was getting hold of this information. The lady who did the one-day refund, the largest tax refund in Russian history, Olga Stepanova, has an official salary of $38,000 a year and has assets of $38,912,000 registered in her husband's name. And we found $12 million of Credit Suisse private bank Zurich. We've written to the prosecutor in Switzerland. They've frozen those accounts. Jameson Firestone, Sergei's boss at Firestone Duncan law firm in Moscow, took all this information, filed it with all the different law enforcement agencies in Russia for each of these officials. And the Deputy Interior Minister of Russia was then interviewed on Echo Moscow radio saying, what do you have to say about all this stuff? Aren't you going to investigate these officers? And he says, his answer was, this is not part of our remit. And this has become, by the way, the most famous case in Russia. In every newspaper, they reported all these assets, all this money, etc. Every newspaper. Every person in Russia knows the names Kuznetsov, Kharkov, and Stepanov. They're famous. Except for one person, the Interior Minister of Russia. When asked on RBC daily newspaper, what about these people, he says, I've not seen anything about this. Everybody's just trying to pull at threads. And the official Interior Ministry response to all these assets was, and this comes from Irina Dudukina, the same lady who said that Sergei never complained about his health, we made all the required checks, all the wealth is legitimated and declared. In relation to the tax officials, the ones who made this lady, Stepanova, who got the 38 million, she says the tax officials were tricked. And in relation to the case of the payments, it's normal practice. And she made a third statement, which we didn't put on the slide, which was when they asked, where's the money? She said, well, we can't find the money because the truck carrying all the documents exploded. Instead of prosecuting these guys, the three main Interior Ministry officers that were central to this crime were all promoted from major to lieutenant colonel. And on the one-year anniversary of Sergei Magnitsky's death, on National Police Day, they received special state honors. Oleg Chilchenko, the guy who refused Sergei medical attention, was named Best Investigator. And Irina Dudukina, this sort of habitual lying lady, was given a special award of gratitude. Now again, as I said, this is an authoritarian regime, not a totalitarian regime. And there are little pockets of goodness in all this badness. And one of the pockets is this thing called the President's Human Rights Council. The President of Russia has a Human Rights Council. And its council consists of real people who are really interested in human rights. There's a guy named Mikhail Fedotov who chairs this council, and it's composed of people like Lyudmila Alexieva, one of the most famous human rights activists, Elena Panfilova, head of Transparency International, and many others. And in addition to the Moscow Public Oversight Commission investigation, they decided to do their own investigation into the death of Sergei Magnitsky. And they concluded their investigation on the 5th of July this year, and they concluded that Magnitsky's arrest and detention were in breach of his European Convention rights. He was beaten, which led to his death. In contravention to the law, he was prosecuted by the same officials he implicated in corruption. State bodies resist the full investigation into corruption and fraud uncovered by Magnitsky, and the Russian courts failed to provide any legal redress to Sergei Magnitsky. And they named names again. President Medvedev responded to this by saying, Magnitsky's case is of course very sad, and indeed some crimes were committed. At this point you would have thought, okay, the President of Russia has acknowledged that crimes were committed, and under his auspices, his Human Rights Council has come up with an independent investigation, including all these terrible things, naming names. And it should all be fixed now. However, it wasn't. The very next day, Tatiana Gerasimova, General Major, First Deputy Head of the Interior Ministry, issues an official statement saying there was no wrongdoing. All decisions were checked by the prosecutors in the court, finding them to be in order. And we received a letter 2 weeks later saying the President's Human Rights Council report does not contain any information or any relevant evidence whatsoever. So let me finish off by telling you how the Russians are trying to spin this internationally. President Medvedev learned about Sergei Magnitsky's death about a week after he died, and it had so much public resonance that he assigned the General Prosecutor of Russia and the Justice Minister of Russia, this is the guy who said, let's not make an innocent victim out of Magnitsky, to do a probe. A week after that, President Medvedev announced that they're firing 20 prison officials because of Magnitsky's death. And the papers all reported that some real things are moving because they're firing all these officials. But these guys hadn't bothered in the presidential administration to get their story straight with the Federal Penitentiary Service. Because the Penitentiary Service then let it be known that all the firings had actually been agreed in October, and they had nothing to do with Magnitsky's death. And in fact, even if they hadn't said that, if you just did any cursory analysis of the people who were fired, you may not be able to see this back in the back of the room, but like the number one guy on the list, Mr. Amayev, who's head of the pretrial detention system in the Baikal region. If anyone knows the geography of Russia, Lake Baikal is like 13 hours from Moscow. And I'm sure this is a very bad man, but I guarantee you he wasn't colluding to do anything bad to Magnitsky. The investigation that the President ordered has now been extended for the 8th time until the 24th of November this year. Now, interestingly, while all this has been going on, I've been campaigning to impose sanctions on all the people who did all this nasty stuff outside of Russia, visa sanctions and asset freezes. And it started to get traction. And the Russians started to panic. And so they said to themselves, we have to do something now, because this visa sanction stuff could be really detrimental to our ability to travel. And so they finally decided this September now, we're almost 2 years after his death, to prosecute 2 doctors. They opened a criminal case against a doctor named Litvinova and a doctor named Kratov. But interestingly, and this is very interesting, they're prosecuting these 2 doctors for not having diagnosed Sergei as having hepatitis and diabetes. The problem is that Sergei didn't have hepatitis and diabetes. So I can imagine that they could be pretty well defended in court for not being negligent in this particular case. However, the one thing which is most shocking about this is that there's a list of 60 people who are intimately involved in this based on documentary evidence, based on signatures on documents denying him medical attention, based on signature on documents fabricating evidence for his incarceration, based on all sorts of objective and documentary evidence. Those 60 people were put on a list by Senator Benjamin Cardin, who chairs the U.S. Helsinki Commission, to be banned from the United States. And out of his list of 60, 58 of these officials, every single person from the Interior Ministry, Prosecutor's Office, Federal Security Service, tax authorities, and civil courts have been exonerated. Just these 2 doctors at the bottom. Now, and to truly insult all of our, particularly those in this room, they decided to do something which is unprecedented in the history of at least recent jurisprudence. They decided, we were talking about trials in absentia, how about a trial posthumously against a dead man? They've reopened the criminal case against Sergei Magnitsky on the 2nd of August this year to prosecute him for the crimes that they had arrested him before, which is what led to his death. 20 months after he's dead, they've announced they want to prosecute a dead man. They announced on the 4th of August, 2 days after that, that the guilt of Magnitsky has been fully proven. And they've now summoned his mother as a witness in the criminal case against her dead son by the same investigator who killed her son. Now, if this had ever been a proper process, they would be investigating all these people for torture, murder, and fraud. Instead, there's 2 doctors being investigated for negligence of the wrong thing. And this is probably, if there was, so this is a seminar in law generally, but this little presentation is a seminar in legal nihilism. And that's where I want to leave it. And hopefully that's enriched you enough to think, well, what does one do about this? And I think John will at least tell you a little bit about one of the things that can be done about this.